Welcome to Dialogues and Development. So this is the series in which we invite speakers from the world of urban development and development planning, and particularly speakers who share the DPU's ethos and mission, and with whom we collaborate on a range of different research, practice and advocacy projects, to come and talk to us and showcase their expertise and give you a live insight into what's going on in the world of urban development and development planning today. Today, I was going to say today's is our first Dialogues and Development session, but actually one just squeezed in yesterday very quickly, where we had a colleague from Brazil, from the collective Anônima Arquitectura, Vitória Braga, talking to us. But today's, while not being the first, is very special because today is World Habitat Day, and the theme for World Habitat this year is urban crisis. So we're very happy to have Aroma Ravi, the VC of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, talking to us about educating practitioners in a time of climate crisis. To introduce the session and to introduce Aroma in a bit more detail, I'm very happy to have Professor Karen Levy here, who is Emeritus Professor of Transformative Urban Planning at the Development Planning Unit. So I'll hand over to you, Karen.
Thank you, and welcome all. Thanks, Julian. So it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening in a little bit more detail, and to start by saying that this evening's event is of special importance for a number of reasons. First, we have with us this evening, as Julian said, Aroma Ravi, who is the founding director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, henceforth known as IIHS, and today is the first Vice Chancellor of IIHS, which was recently declared a university in India. So welcome, Aro. And what a wonderful milestone for IIHS, a unique and collectively constructed institution built on so much hard work and driven by passion and exceptional leadership at all levels. Today, IIHS is India's leading interdisciplinary knowledge institution and a distinct university focused on equitable, sustainable, and efficient transformation of Indian cities, towns, and villages. And its urban focus is distinct globally as a university with an urban focus. Also, welcome to Neha Semi from IIHS, who's been very much part of this inspirational process and who is here with us in the audience. This evening, we also share and celebrate, I think, a 15-year partnership between the DPU and IIHS, which started in 2009. This is a partnership that is both personal for me and institutional for the DPU. And it's a partnership that's been based on exchange and learning about practice-based education and research, and focusing on the challenges of urban development. It's a relationship that we've built over those years based on shared values, on the shared commitments, and in a sense of urgency about the enormous challenges facing urban settlements at the moment. So this evening, it's very timely to welcome IIHS to the DPU because, as Julian said, we're in the first week of October every year is acknowledged as World Habitat Day, actually usually the Monday of the week. We have a little latitude there. And the World Habitat theme this year is, as Julian said, urban crisis response, which we will look at through the lens of higher education and research in India. This evening, the session will explore the nature and understanding of this challenge and how it can be tackled through effective development of curriculum and pedagogy in the education of a new generation of urban practitioners and what Arama calls system integrators, who can respond strategically with principles of sustainability, inclusion, and equality at the forefront. We could not have a more interesting and experienced speaker to address this topic. Arama Revi has 40 years of interdisciplinary problem-solving experience in India and abroad, working at local, national, and global levels. And as I've intimated, he is an educator and an institution builder, as witnessed by IHS itself. He's also one of the world's leading climate scientists and urban sustainability and disaster risk reduction professionals, with a wide and deep experience of governance, institutional development, management, and implementation across public, private, academic, and civil society institutions. He has many international accomplishments. Two in particular have resonance with this evening, in fact, probably many more, but I've selected these two. Arama co-chaired the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, where he led a successful global campaign for the establishment of what became SDG 11, the urban SDG, in the UN 2030 Development Agenda. The other thing that I'd like to highlight, because it's very relevant to today, is Arama's work as a leading participant and author of the urban chapters in the IPCC assessment reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and their assessment reports. So, with no further ado, I hand over to you, Arama, for our session this evening.
Thanks, Karen. So it's a pleasure to be back here. I was here not so long ago, talking to a number of you. And this is an old history, and I think in some senses for Neha and myself, it is, it's an honor of a tremendous partnership that we built over many, many years. So I'll start a little bit by describing what we do as an institution. In fact, when I was sitting in the afternoon, I did a little bit of sort of archaeology. And the next slide will show you what the archaeology is like, because it's not 15 years, it's actually 17.
Yes, I dropped a year or two.
I know, I almost forgotten it. So this is the slide that I used in 2008 when we were having the first discussions about establishing the university.
Yes.
India, like many other places, has lots of challenges, and DPU's had a long history of engagement, starting from Otto, who actually did a lot of work in Bangalore and many other places, and then so many of you here. So we have a great debt and a partnership that we've seen over many years. And we're very grateful that we've been able to do this stuff and co-create this together. Because when we started to kind of build this institution, we obviously knew from the work of DPU and other colleagues in many other parts of the world that it's possible to do this kind of stuff. But for us, the challenge was actually to do this at scale, right? And it's taken a long while to build the university, but in between we've done a fair amount of interesting things. So the next one is, it was interesting for me to even reflect on that. So this is what I said 17 years ago. This was the plan that we had. So that's a reality in some senses. At that point of time, we were very bullish about the fact, in fact, we had been invited by the Indian Prime Minister to establish the university. So, that was something that we took for granted in some senses. And we hoped that, this is in 2008, right? That we would get up and running in 2012. And there were a lot of us who were involved in a very interesting process that lasted almost 3 years, where we actually developed the epistemic framework for the university. And we were very lucky to do that. It really happens that you have a whole range of people who have the opportunity to do that. And we asked a very, very simple question in 2009. That's what Karen was talking about. And that question was, what would it take, or what knowledges would young people need to have to actually help transform India in 2030? And this question you can ask in any generation and any sort of in any geography in that sense. And the reason we thought about that, because we were kind of foolish at that point of time, was we thought the university would come into functioning in 2012. People would come out of that by about 15 or 16, and then they'll have 15 years to really do something, fine. Because it's only when you've got about 10 or 15 years experience that some people take you seriously. You're actually in the middle management of institutions, whether it's public or private or in politics, and then you can actually effect change. Some of us have gone on a little further than that, but that's a minimum idea. And I guess the interesting question for us at that point of time is, we couldn't actually find enough people and enough knowledges to be able to populate that process. So we started a process. We brought in people from across the world. There were 200 people that were involved from pretty much all geographies. And after a long discussion and a search, the DPU and the UCL were the anchor for the conversation in this geography. Of the UK was a little bit different, this is pre-Brexit. And Europe and many other colleagues from Latin America, from Africa, etc. So there was a global conversation to kind of answer that question. And I think the part of the answer was you cannot look at things only through silos. The silos of even planning. Planning is a very wide-ranging discipline. It has many different aspects to it. But what it struck, what we knew from practice at least, was that you really need to come at it from individual or community forward, or from problem forward. So we basically constructed this institution around problematics. So for example, as I'll show you in a second, we don't have departments. We have schools, and all the schools are interdisciplinary schools, and they're organized around particular themes: governance, economic development, sustainability, and stuff like that. Of course, we have academics, and we have researchers, and we have practitioners, but they're embedded into trying to solve those problems at a particular point in time. But anyway, this was a frame where we knew very clearly that we had to build a full service institution, which means that the bottom of the pyramid would be undergraduates. And you can see the stuff up there. There's a gap in the undergraduate story. For us, that will start in 2027. We're just starting to actually build that. So you can see in the arc of institutional development in many contexts, and I could say maybe having seen similar experiments in parts of Africa, Latin America, etc., sometimes it takes a long time to build transformative institutions, but if you hold on to these ideas, then eventually you're able to land. So we've done some useful stuff. So that's history. So all that I'm saying is we had some idea about some things. We've actually done much better than many other things as far as that's concerned. But building a truly transformative institution takes a lot of time and effort. So what are we? We are now, of course, a university with a heterodox design. Like Aaron was saying just now, we're basically starting with 4 interdisciplinary master's program. We'll start a new one, another one next year, and of course a PhD. Now, people ask us this question of why did you start with a master's and a PhD program? And part of that answer came from our curriculum process, which brought together, like I said, a couple of hundred practitioners, academics from North America, Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And I think what we discovered was that working to build an undergraduate program is a very tough thing. In fact, if I remember very clearly, our US colleagues basically said it's impossible to build an interdisciplinary program around cities at the undergraduate level because their framework was different. But at that point of time, there were 2 particular programs that had actually done that. One in Mexico, UNAM started their program in '76, just after Habitat 1, and then Paris started their program a little bit later. So there was a history of doing that. So basically, the idea is that you have a pyramid, and the base of the pyramid is undergraduate education. The reason that's very important in a country like India is a whole range of people find it almost impossible to be part of an educational process for more than 3 or 4 years because they have to go out, they have to earn, they have to do things, and that would be their terminal degree in some senses. So to get a master's education even in 2025 in India for a lot of people, even though the aspirations are quite strong, is a privilege, and a doctoral education is kind of unthinkable in some senses. Even though elites that are connected in our country to other parts of the world would actually think and see these things differently. So you've got to build that process. And in some senses, if any of you have actually, I can see colleagues who might be here from China. China has done this very successfully. I've seen Chinese processes working now for 25 years, and you really need to build that base as far as that's concerned. So what makes us different? We have a globally benchmarked curriculum, and when we designed this thing, we didn't know it would actually work. But through a lot of hard work that my colleagues have put in over 10 years, we've been teaching, and we have a few people here. There is one victim of our experience here in this room. We've been teaching a fellowship program, and by and large, I think the 350 people who went through that have done pretty well. So let's say the proof is interdisciplinary education is possible, people can actually learn. That's the most important. The teaching is less important, but the learning is more important. They can actually go and do real things and get real jobs and do pretty well. And some of them will go on to do higher education in other places. So of the 350 that came through our program, about 15% of them are in the top universities in the world, even though we were not giving a master's degree at that point of time. Right? So it's the quality of the program, the quality of the people that actually matter as far as we're concerned. So basically the method works. We are absolutely certain about it. And that's the reason why we're going to scale it. We're going to double every 2 years, etc., etc. The second thing, of course, like I said, is when we started, there were two big challenges with Indian higher education in this space. It was fragmented. So you had engineers and you had people working in health and X and Y and Z. Nobody was able to bring this together. The second thing is what people were teaching was either from the 50s or the 60s or the 70s in India. People who used notes that came from God only knows where, or they were teaching from stuff that came from other locations. Right? So you pick stuff from a general education, which comes from other locations, is actually very good. I think the interesting thing about our partners, especially the DPU, is that in the process of co-creation that's happened here from the 70s, I've seen it from the 80s onwards, you've really got a different angle on doing this compared to conventional institutions. So you have a very different way of doing this kind of thing. Your insights are very different, your engagement is different, and that's what really made us, made you a natural partner for us and that process. So basically, the challenge of building a faculty that was grounded in solving problems at scale in our context was a significant challenge, and we've done that, I think, pretty successfully. And the second thing is building knowledges and building research that's based both on practice and theory building that place was an issue. Now, one of the interesting problems that we've had is that it's taken a long time to make this happen. But the inverse of that, and Karen has reflected on this for many years, is that because we had the time, we could actually build this huge corpus of knowledge that is based on practice that we were involved in, which actually animates a lot of our work there. So we're talking about grounded knowledge. We're talking about things that actually happen. So when people come to us, they come to not only to some of the leading scholars in the world in this space, or certainly in India, but also some of the people who've actually implemented these questions. So that's the other thing that makes us different. And then, of course, the interdisciplinary school engagement means that our structure is quite different, right? So what are we trying to do? Basically, unfortunately, we're the single institution at the moment. There should be many more that is trying to create a process which is going to be the largest transformation in the largest urban transformation in history. China's transformation is tailing off just now. India is just starting, South Asia is starting, because similar things happening in Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc., etc., etc. And Africa's is just about to start, where we will see hundreds of millions of people who will be living in urban contexts, many of them in informal, many various forms of informality, which makes life very different now than what it was when Latin America and, of course, earlier Europe and North America had actually transformed themselves. That's a core challenge. So for us, like we just heard just now, our job is not to train the specialists. We're not trying to train the engineers, or even, I would say, the architects, the planners, the urban designers. Those are particular disciplines that are very important to actually transform the city or transform the landscape that starts, in our context, from villages to small towns to larger places. We are trying to train the people who will bring this all together, because that's the biggest gap that we have in India at the current point in time. We have lots of people who can do lots of things, but it's impossible to weave this process together, and hence systemic change doesn't happen. So that, of course, means that you have to draw people from a range of disciplines and practices. You've got to bring them into a teaching learning environment which challenges them. You also have to have a faculty who can actually help curate that process. And then you have a different way of problem solving that's very critical. So we are literally trying to, at scale, build this new generation of practitioners. And again, the theory is very simple around this. The theory is basically you cannot make change at scale that is sustainable unless you're able to build and transform institutions. And institutions, as we know, are transformed by people. So we're trying to build those people, irrespective of what sector it may be. It may be the government. A lot of our people go out into the private sector. It could be academia. It could also be politics, which I think is very important in this place. So you need to have a large enough pool of people who are able to work together as a collective, even though they may be working at different institutions, to make that change. Because this is a huge shift, fine? It's a cultural shift that involves at least 600 to 700 million people. So think of the entire population of the United States and Europe together transforming their life over a period of 20 or 30 years. You have to have the knowledges in the process to make that happen. And of course, you need to have knowledges that are based on solution solving as far as that's concerned. So basically, we do this, like I said earlier, by doing interdisciplinary teaching research. So our structure is somewhat different from most places. Of course, UCL is different from many other universities. So we don't really make a significant difference between, what we would call practice or applied research and research. We encourage everybody to be able to involve in that process, because essentially there is a virtuous cycle between what you teach and learn, what you actually do, the changes that you actually make on the ground through a whole range of things, including implementation, what people would call consulting or applied research, etc., and the research. It feeds one into the other. And once you've got that system working, people actually in their own careers and in their own practices and their teaching actually bring those processes in. Now, conventional institutions, again, DPU is quite different, but most segregate these processes out, not only within the institution, but between them. And our challenge was to try and bring that together so that fragmentation in some senses would go away and you'd get the synergies of having that conversation. So, one of the interesting things, as I said, we didn't know this would happen, but this is what we've done in whatever, 15, 16 years. We've concretely touched the lives of 20 million people. That was not where we started, but because we were not teaching, we've actually gone and done this. There's attributable to evidence that we worked. But of course, for India, 20 million is very small, fine. That's 3% of our urban population. As far as we're concerned, we said if we don't get to 11, 12, we've really not done anything. But the fact is that you can do things at scale, and it's possible for that to happen. Fine? That's the first thing that's there. And in doing that, because some of us have made our colleagues' lives very miserable, they also write and do research. So we've published a lot from that process, and really high quality stuff. So you've got the numbers up there. We should be touching about 100,000 citations in the next 2-3 months. So we are very well cited both inside and outside, because our work is at multiple levels. There's hyperlocal work, there's local work, there's regional work, there's national work, and then there's global stuff that's actually happening. So there's continuous sort of movement between that, because in a world where the internet and now AI is all over the place, it would be really stupid not to have that mobility. So part of what we teach and learn is how to handle stuff at multiple scales across a whole different kinds of institutions and multiple disciplines at the same time. It seems like it's complicated, but once you learn how to swim, it's kind of okay as far as it's concerned. We do a lot of project-based work, because that's where we learn and teach and fail. Okay, because the most important way of actually making the change is to fail and get up and then fix it as far as it's concerned. And we're a national institution now. I mean, because we've not been distracted by too much of teaching, we're working across the whole country, and we're working in a lot of places. So there's a lot of imbibed knowledge of change and activity at various places. We're working across India. At least has about 8, 9, 10,000 cities at the moment. We haven't had a census for a while. So that gives you a sense of scale. So what I'm saying is, you can build institutions that can do these kind of things. It's very hard and it takes a lot of energy and effort, but it's possible to make this happen. And we have other examples in other places of people trying to do similar things. So all that I'm saying is, if we can do it here, it can absolutely be done somewhere else. India is a complicated place to do this kind of stuff. That's why it's taken us so long to be able to persuade the government to give us the clearances to be able to teach like this. Because it doesn't fit into the conventional paradigm of doing things. So that's what we did for a while. And I'm giving you this context so we can stop for a bit, and then I'll show you a case of how this applies to climate and risk and stuff like that. So how do we work? We work around 5 interdisciplinary schools. So like I said, a school of governance that works on all of these kind of themes that are there. So most of them are recognizable, and I'm sure you have stuff that you deal with in your teaching and research here that cuts across this. Then we have a school of economic development that does some really, really cutting edge interesting work that touches on a whole range of questions. And what you'll see here again is we have a focus on systems, because at least in our framework, cities are systems of systems, both social and economic, and of course ecological as far as that's concerned. We try and take a systemic view of processes, because many of the wicked problems we are dealing with are about trying to solve systemic challenges. And in a sense, the crisis that we have today is a crisis precisely because it's systemic and it's wicked at the same time. You poke it in one direction and it turns somewhere else in the other direction. So one has to understand how to deal with it, consciously as far as that's concerned. Then we have the School of Human Development, which I think is probably the first school of its kind in the world, which in a sense brings together many things, education, health, but it's fundamentally dealing with questions of inequality, which is a core question in India, whether it's caste or gender or a whole range of other questions. And we have a whole range of instruments to engage and deal with this kind of question. And then we have, of course, probably our largest school that focuses on systems and infrastructure, which is kind of a little bit more recognizable in some ways. But again, we take a deeply systemic view of this. There's obviously a very strong political economy angle to it. We look at the environment and institutions as embedded in all of these processes and systems. And in some senses, some of our most complex impact stories, like in water and sanitation or energy or even solid waste, is tied into institutional processes, how governance is organized, how communities and sort of governments sort of dialogue or contest in some senses, because without that, change is not possible. And then, of course, we have a fairly well-known school just now that focuses on environment and sustainability and deals with all these questions. So basically, somewhat different from other places. It's the same kind of thing that you do, but it's organized differently. So we think differently. So they're economists and all of social scientists and planners and sort of technical people in all these kind of schools that are there. We also do a lot of research. Neha actually anchors the research program, and at some point in time she wants to do stuff. She can talk about that. We work actually across 35 different areas. So people say, okay, you're just an institute. You're not a university. How can a university just work on questions of urban? And we say, look, we are not an urban institution. We're not a planning school. We deal with the entire context of urbanization. So I have colleagues who work actively on villages and on agriculture, because food security is a very critical question as far as we're concerned. We also have people who work on the gig economy and how that works on the high end, let's say, of the service sector spectrum. So the core question is, how do we use research to be able to engage and address these questions? And I think we've had a wonderful sort of process of co-creation here with the DPU team over many, many years to really examine these questions in multiple geographies. And I think for us, at least in India, apart from our own work, which is obviously grounded and is driven by the realities of what we're dealing with, our engagement and partnerships with colleagues across the world, whether it's in Cuba or in Ghana or in East Africa or in Thailand, etc., have been very, very critical, because there are so many processes that are tied together and integrated across the world that keep us where we are. To being able to work with people in different contexts gives us the ability to look at things differently and also draw from their epistemic, their practical, and their pedagogic experience of how to make that difference. So I think the learning that we've done collectively on this, whether it's looking at planners across Africa or Latin America, etc., other colleagues who are not here, like Adriana, have been so central to that set of dialogues that are really important to what we're doing. So again, we work on many areas, and then you take all of this stuff, and then you create an environment in which people can learn. Fine. I don't talk about teaching, because in some senses you can't really teach anybody anything, especially if they don't want to learn. And what's the proof that the story works? This is actual evidence from the fellowship program that we ran. So what you have here on the left hand side here is the incoming disciplines people came from. Fine. And what you have on the right hand side is where they went to. Fine. So essentially what you can see is, it looks like a spaghetti, but the fact is, this is the outcome of an educational process, which we are now going to take to scale, where people are able to traverse from one set of areas into others. Of course, there are particular pathways that are important, and I think this is again something that we've done with colleagues at the DPU. We've tried to understand this in the context of planning in various parts of the world, because when you look at people's careers, and we're doing this systematically with people who've been with us over the last 10 years, we're tracking how their own engagement with various questions start. So basically, this can be done. The conventional framework says that you've got to be a specialist, and that's the only way to go out and do stuff. And if you want to do something more than that, then you get two specializations, and that's important. But for us, the educational frame is what we call the T, fine? So you have the core discipline, which you need to have. If you don't have that, you're kind of lost, or a core practice, and then you need to cross-cut, fine? Some of us, of course, have two legs to the T. Most of our faculty have three. And as we build up over time, you have multiple practices. But basically, you need those two elements of the T to actually make a difference, because without that, the kind of problem solving that you're going to be engaging with, the kind of academic research that you're going to be dealing with, the kind of policies that you're going to be dealing with, become quite difficult. So this has been done, and again, I'm sure if you track the same thing, you'll find something that's relatively similar here. If you were to look at the last 50 years of DPU, you'd find similar kind of processes and look at people's careers as far as it's concerned. So what do? We basically, on the master's side, we have four different programs in the fifth one coming next year, and they look a little bit different. And this is the reason that we were very challenged in trying to explain to India's higher education regulators what the hell we were actually doing. So in everything you see that very often there's the word practice coming in here. So when you're talking about sustainability science, which is like a fairly complex space, I've created the space for many years just now. It's not only the science itself that's giving you a sense of the interdisciplinary theoretical space, it's also the practice we're dealing with. So you can see that again being repeated on climate change science and practice, and I'll give you some examples of how we try and do that if we have the time. And then we brought together two very important areas for India, economic development and infrastructure. Because at the moment that's the collision between those two, or let's say the synergies between the two, is what is driving a lot of interesting new things and also some problematic practices. And then we have something which allows a lot of flexibility for people who want to explore a whole range of processes in the university around urban studies and practice. So these are 4 master's programs which are up and running just now. There are about 20 odd people in each one of them. And then of course, it works itself out. So how does it play itself out? And this comes from the work that we did together almost 15 years ago. A slightly different frame that's there. This of course has been realigned for India's higher education environment. We have foundation courses which are about experiential learning. This is explicitly part of our curriculum frame, and these are typically courses that are compulsory. Everybody has to go through them. Fine? And so we brought in the experiential learning framework into the university curriculum, and they're credited as far as that's concerned. And then of course we have core courses where we really try and bring together people from 10 clusters of disciplines, which is about maybe 15, 20 disciplines, to be able to explain and enable the sociologists to talk to the economists, for the media arts person to talk to the technologists, etc., etc. And not only talk to them, because problem solving has to be done collectively, but also understand where they come from, to understand their epistemic background, to be able to call out when they see a way of dealing with a problem or a way of trying to frame things, where it comes from and where it might be going as far as it's concerned. Then other stuff that's much more understandable for most conventional university environments. We have a whole set of elective courses that give you the ability to cut down and connect things. The other thing that's very important to us, which is kind of for professional schools is pretty obvious, is practical. So literally in day 2 people go out into the field. That's where problem-based learning is actually organized. So we have a sort of learner-centric environment, which we think it is, and we also have a problem-based learning framework that says you go in and work in teams to try and solve problems, which is what it's like, I guess, in many parts of the world. And then of course, very obviously, this is where Indian education is sometimes fairly weak. There's a very strong emphasis on methods, because if you have the methods and you're able to understand the epistemology behind the methods, you're able to then interrogate and create new ways of doing things, which is what you need to do when you come up with a problem that other people have not dealt with, in a sense. So that's the frame that we work as far as that's concerned. So I mean, this is probably more interesting for academics in the room, less to so many of the students. And then you play them out. So this is what we do in the Masters in Climate Change and Practice, and I'll speak a little bit about this and give you an example. This is what we do in Sustainability Science. You see a lot of familiar names and other such things that are there. This is what we do in Urban Economic Development. So they are different in many ways, but the way that we organize life is the first 2 terms, and Neha just finished sort of teaching part of the governance layer that's there, is collectively taught right across the program. So you're building a cohort of people who actually have a common language. They can start solving problems together. They have a common theoretical framework across their multiple disciplines as far as that's concerned. But then they go on to apply it and work in terms 3, 4, 5 further. This is what we do on urban studies, which basically allows you flexibility to build and curate your own learning journey in some senses. Now, this is objective evidence of what we have. This is what our incoming class this year, September 1st, kind of looks like. Okay, and for us, the most important thing is to make sure, and you can see these 12 boxes here, that we curate the boxes that we actually have enough people in the class. And you can see, for example, there's some gaps in this thing because we started quite late in the admissions process. But next year we expect to have a balance across this. The key thing is, because we're a peer learning based institution, the idea is very simple. You get a set of people who are very engaged, charged up, wants to learn, and a lot of the learning actually happens because they're talking to each other and they're solving problems together. So in a sense, the educators are helping facilitate that process. That's the first critical thing that's there. So if you have the mix of disciplines in every class, you get that range of engagement. Plus something that you can't see very clearly here, and that is we privilege life experience more than, especially in a country like India and I guess in China, than whether you get 99.9 percentile, etc. Most of our system is driven, like a French press, by a system where you get into elite institutions based on the grades that you get on some not very interesting and not very nice examination. We don't believe life works like that. At least our experience of what really changes in the world is it doesn't fit with most people. That says we say if you're willing to learn, we'll have you, but you have to work very hard to make that happen. So if you're willing to learn and you bring your life experience into the room, it actually changes the teaching learning environment. So in our classes, for example, this year I think we have 65% or so first generation learners. So normally that would be seen as a great disadvantage. For us, that's a huge advantage because people come with a life experience, both culturally, because caste and gender are so critical in our country, of negotiating those questions. So people with privilege in some senses should be paying a lot more to be able to work with people who actually have life experience of trying to deal with these problems in their everyday life. So that's the hidden curriculum in some senses which drives the process. And we found that's a very effective way of actually doing things. So when we create the class, our admissions process is designed to produce this kind of environment that's there, so that the learning can actually happen. It's significant. It's usually fun, but it can be contested as far as that's concerned. Then, of course, we have a PhD program that's quite interesting. We had a lot of trouble this year because I was just telling Julian we got 240 applications for 10 slots. So the faculty had real trouble trying to be able to curate that set. So, but again, similar kind of processes. It's a taught program for a couple of years, and we've got a pretty interesting cohort that comes from various disciplines. Because again, when we run our program, we don't, normally what happens in most places, many of us have gone through that, is that you come in and you do a PhD program with a particular advisor in a particular department, and that's where you stay, and that's where you succeed, and that's how you build your life and your career. In our case, the cohort is across the university. So every school is dealing with the doctoral students together, because we're trying to build a cohort of urbanists who understand these questions. You might be somebody who's working on the ecology of X, Y, and Z, or somebody who's working on a social, a question of social transformation, etc. If you're able to teach and learn, we're able to learn together, at least our theory, and we'll find this out in 4 years' time, is that you'll come out as a much better academic researcher and a practitioner. So that's in a sense what we do. I can stop here for a while. I have an interesting example of how we do this stuff in practice, which I can show you.
I want to, just because I've got my eyes on the clock, I would love you to get into that example that you keep promising. I know we've got lots of examples already, but I know
I'm just going to show you something which is, Cassidy knows about this, because we're working at the front end of I was meant to talk about risk and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate here, and I'm going to show you how it plays itself out. So I'm going to take you, this is a paper that's in the process of review at the moment. And the question that we're trying to understand here is, how do you take a large metropolitan city and figure out what's going to happen to it over the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years as far as climate change is concerned. And the fact is that climate change is not an add-on. Climate change is a symptom of a very serious problem, and that problem is called maldevelopment, inequality, etc. All the wonderful things that create and build our cities, right? So this is a frame that we're using just now. It's kind of in process. We're using it for the IPCC. It's a paper that's being put together. So the question is, if you look at a large metropolitan city, I'm going to do this bottom up. I'm going to look at a city, and then I'm going to show you how it aggregates if we have time. It's going to be like a little bit like a reel. So don't look at the content, just get the overall story of how you break this down. So this is a city. It's a mega city. It's called Bangalore. This is what the analytical frame looks like, right? So you know where it is, etc., etc. So we're saying, okay, what are the dimensions in which you can act to make sure that the city actually works? The first one is a little confusing. It's a lot of ecology and climate. It's the climate class that's there. The second one, of course, is what's the form like? Is it big, small? How is it growing, etc. The third one is basically, what's the level of development like? And I've given you the categories which have been processed through a large database of 9,000 cities across the world. So I'm just going to show you how the method works. Then, what are the emissions like? What happens to the greenhouse gases? What are driving them? This shows you the most important category of where the greenhouse gas emissions come from. Basically, interestingly, Bangalore, a lot of the emissions come from industry and waste, and less from residential sector. Then, what is the big issue the city is going to face? This is a city on top of a plateau. It's 13 million people or whatever it is. It's a very nice place. So you don't have earthquakes, you don't have cyclones and stuff like that. But now, as you can see in the data I'm going to show you in a second, we have lots of challenges in terms of extreme precipitation. Of course, it's a little bit funny because in other places they get flooded. They say we really get flooded, here we get a lot of rain. So there's a back and forth with people in Bangalore on that question. And then of course, something we often forget, and that is that cities are dependent on ecological systems for their survival. If this changes, which is the ecological class, then you have real problems as far as this is concerned, and especially if the temperatures are going to rise to 2 degrees or 3 degrees, which is what we're negotiating around Paris, this will change. So we're basically saying these are at least 5 dimensions of action. You can focus on the form, you can contain growth, and all the planning stuff happens around that. You can focus on the economics, on the development side, you can look at this. You can focus on trying to make sure you can decarbonize, which is the story around emissions. Because decarbonization is not working very much, most places you have to look at adaptation. And if you don't do adaptation along with biodiversity conservation, you might be in trouble, right? That's the high level frame that's there. So what is the underlying data that makes this work? And this is coming from the work we do, and we do this in many other cities that are there. This is how you try and understand what drives the form. I'm just showing you variables at the moment. So the form is, how big the city is, how quickly it's growing, is there a lot of green in it, how is it actually expanding? In this particular case, there's sprawl, plus there's vertical densification happening like we have in other cities. And then, how much is the sprawl happening? These have got lots of underlying databases inside that. So that gives you a sense of what are the dimensions of stuff that you can define from the form. On the development side, you can see stuff that you must be familiar with, what the GDP per capita is like, what the Human Development Index is. Bangalore is better than many other parts of India. Gender Development Index is better than many other parts of the country, it's still relatively high. Then there are 2 other indices on inequality and access to infrastructure. So that's another set of things. And then you break it down to look at emissions. So what is the total amount of emissions that you have cumulatively over the last 30 years or so? What are the amount of emissions that you have? This is a climate justice question as far as that's concerned. Where does it come from? And you can see here much of it is coming from the industrial sector and waste. Is there a potential for solar PV use? And how old are the buildings? This is an index, but this is a very important question which differentiates cities from, let's say, Europe and UK from the cities that we have, because many of the cities have been built very recently. So if you build them properly, you don't have to do very much. The challenge in a city like this is when you have a 100-year-old house or a 200-year-old house, you have a real problem retrofitting the house. And God help you if you can retrofit the house, because then you have to retrofit the infrastructure. So you might be in a city like New York, which is very rich and has a lot of resources, but it's really tough to retrofit Victorian infrastructure and energy systems. So you need to take a holistic view of how the emission sites work, and then you look at all the nice things that happen when we're looking at climate hazards. So here, for example, you can see secular rise of about 1 degree, about 0.9 degrees over 50 years as far as Bangalore's temperature is concerned. People in Bangalore complain a lot about it getting very hot. Actually, it's very nice. But that rise in temperature is significant, fine. And depending if you have urban heat island, it becomes. But the most important thing is not the temperature story. It is that if you look at the base that's there, you've got mean annual precipitation about 900 mm, 15% increase in precipitation. That's really starting to make a difference. So especially if you're in a low-lying area, your drainage is not good, which is typically of Indian cities, you have a problem in this space. So the science is telling you that stuff, plus other stuff that's the extreme event stuff, the stuff that many of us in Cassidy work on. How many events do you have? So heat waves you don't pick up from the mean temperature, you pick it up from the extremes. This gives you a sense of what's actually going to happen, how is it going to play itself out along many of what we call climate impact drivers on this side. So obviously, there's no sea level rise issue, it's not near the sea. There are no landslides because it's on top of a plateau, but there's sometimes cyclonic storms that come across the coast that impact it. So you start understanding the dynamics of how the climate system is actually affecting the city. This is all historical data. And then of course you're saying, okay, fine. There's a medium risk of invasion of invasive species. There are a whole range of issues as far as that's concerned. We've got pretty good soil carbon storage as far as this city is concerned. So this is a multi-dimensional way of trying to break things down. How the city is growing, how the economy is working, how the emissions profile is working and changing, what you can do to adapt to it, how you can actually predict biodiversity. Fine. So this is just the beginning of trying to think of what happens. And this is the historical process. Then we come into all the fancy stuff that climate scientists work on. And the question there is, what's going to happen in 2050? So this, I'm trying to make it very simple. There are lots of complicated stuff that's there. But basically we take a scenario. In this case, it's a business as usual scenario. And the question that we're looking for example, is a regime change happening in a particular part of this classification? So in Bangalore's case, because sprawl is going to become so important, the major mix is going to shift from, like you saw just now, industrial emissions and some amount of waste that's there to stuff that's going to come from cars and transportation systems. That's a big shift. So the question then is what you want to do about it. Do you get mass transit in? Do you actually have planning controls? What do you do to be able to manage the land market, to be able to make sure the city is denser, the city is more efficient as far as the concerned? Because this is a regime shift, fine? So if the regime shifts take place, then you have then you need transformative mechanisms to try and deal with that. And then you have all the underlying data, and you'll see some interesting things that are there. And one of the important things that you see here is that some things have numbers on them and some things have colors. The reason that we have numbers is because we have numbers only for some things. But when you're looking at the future, the more important thing in some senses, because decision makers have to take decisions in deep uncertainty often, is how is that variable moving? Is it declining? And you can see it here. Yeah? So increases are the oranges, decreases are the greens, and there's no change in class as far as it's concerned. So we're trying to get this is the whole thing. We're talking about 20 years from now. Cities change, they're difficult to manage. The science cannot tell you deterministically what's going to happen, but at least you need to know, is it going to increase or decrease? Is your inequality going to increase or decrease? Because if it's going to increase, then that may become a particularly important part of intervention as far as you're concerned. So we do it the same dimensions that I showed you for hazards. Biodiversity, of course, we have almost no clue what's going to happen. The modeling capacity in the biodiversity space for what's going to happen is really, within quotes, underdeveloped. It's very tough to figure out what's going to be happening 20 years from now in an urban context. So there's a huge knowledge gap here. If you really want to do lots of academic work and get published and get jobs, this is a big space for that. This is the Greys are telling you there's the problem to be solved, there are jobs hopefully to be found in that place. And then we come to the core question, which we often forget, and that is what's happening on the development context. Of course, we've taken the SDGs. This is not the only way of doing this. So we have a pretty good idea for each of the SDGs how things are working. So for example, you can see that Bangalore is doing a fair amount of stuff on the climate action side. There's lots of stuff happening on the PV thing. The government is doing various things. We're doing pretty well compared to other. This is for the city, fine? It's not for the country. The country is doing badly on many. So Bangalore is doing very well on the job front here, fine? It's not doing so, and it's doing well on the education front. It's also doing not so badly on gender equality. It's not doing well on sanitation and water and sanitation, because it's constrained, fine? It's on top of a city, the water comes from 100 kilometers away, it's pumped up a kilometer, etc. There are lots of issues as far as it's concerned. So you can see for all the core development challenges where the real problems are and where the trends are going to lie. Because eventually, this is what people in the city are solving for, both in their everyday life and in what government is actually doing. And we have ways of trying to look forward as far as it's concerned. Of course, we don't know how the SDGs are going to play out in the UN. I was there just, 10 days ago, and it was rather depressing. But at least we have a framework to look at what's actually happening. So the question is, when you're doing climate-based work, it's done in a context. If you don't sort out this question, you're not able to deal with questions of vulnerability, of capacity, and all the things, if you've ever studied risk, that are important in addressing risk. I won't go into the details there, but basically the core thing for most of our cities is, including in even a city like this, you have to raise the floor of services and accessibility to everybody. So there's deep inequality in our cities across the world, but that's a core strategy. This is what David Satterthwaite and I have been writing about for 15, 20 years. Many of us have been working our lives on this question. We've got to raise the floor as far as that's concerned, to make sure that universal service coverage is accessible to everybody. You can be in a very rich city, but if you don't have accessibility because you don't have affordability, it doesn't work as far as that's concerned. And then you've got to make sure that some critical things, including gender equality, including, where's number 10, reduced inequalities are very, very important, because cities do wonderful things, they create opportunity, but they also concentrate risk, they concentrate poverty, they also concentrate inequality, and we often forget that. That's what a lot of development planning is about, trying to balance out these processes, make sure that the hidden dark sides of things are actually brought into the equation, they're dealt with, the structures work for that, we're able to finance it and see what actually happens. And then we go on to the more interesting stories. Okay, great. We know how the development of the city is going, we know what the risks are like, we know what the emissions are like. How do you solve this problem? And this is where the advance, this is all the work that we've done over the last many years in the FCC. We say, okay, if you want to do stuff on mitigation, these are all the things that you can do. This is an assessment for the city of Bangalore. So the colors here basically are, for example, I take a concrete example here. So I take something like efficient lighting and appliances there, somewhere in the middle, you can see that, fine. This is something that has got very high feasibility. It's kind of easy, because now everything goes to LED, you can do that inside your house, you can do that for all the street lights, it saves you money, it's like easy to do. And you can see in this particular case in Bangalore, there's a lot of this is happening, it's not happening enough. So the symbols here are basically telling you whether action is happening or not. So is this thing feasible? Can it be done? And then that's what the colors are. And is it happening? As what the symbols are. Fine. So this is based on the evidence they are. So we're saying, okay, these are all the options you have as a firm, as somebody in politics, etc., etc. How do you build a portfolio of interventions that actually enable the stuff to change in the other graphs that we're talking about? And then we look at a whole range of things there, saying, okay, suppose you have efficient lighting that says, does it have any relationship with biodiversity? Does it have any relationship to adaptations? We're looking at the interactions between processes that are there. Because the most important and difficult thing is you try and do something here in a wicked problem and something else pushes back. So you better be aware of the fact that every action you have always has some not so nice thing that's happening to somebody else, maybe in the same place or otherwise. If you don't look at that, your interventions typically will get into trouble or they'll fail. So we think of the second order impacts on that. So this is on the emissions side, fine? And this is what happens on the adaptation side, which some of you maybe, it may be easy to look at. So what do? You do land use planning. Urban planning is very important for this because it's about containing and changing the nature of the city, its structure, its logistics, its infrastructure, etc. Your codes and standards are very critical because you can do high performance buildings, but the codes are not incentivizing you to do that. So especially in our parts of the world, it's very complicated to make it happen. You can build climate resilient public infrastructure, and that can make a huge difference, fine? If there's a big cyclonic storm, and let's say your cell phone towers, like in Mumbai, it's happened many times, are driven by generators that are sitting less than a meter above the floor level, and it's flooded, the whole city's communication systems go down, fine? It's kind of pretty obvious. You can find it all over the world. So there are a whole set of these things where the science has been applied to assess how effective they are. Some of these things are not so well known, like for example, in the context of Bangalore, it's not important. Coastal zone defense are not important. So we can look at what is required all the way from the codes and standards to climate insurance. So there's a whole range of different options that have been assessed. We spent a lot of time and effort doing this in the last cycle. We've then developed a plan for India that looks at this kind of question. And then now we're taking it down to city level to try and see how it can be operationalized. And then similarly for biodiversity, fine? Okay? So you have a framework now where you have the solutions, you have the options. The question is how do you put them together? And eventually this has to be operationalized in both space and institutional spaces. So then we go out, and I'm going to show you just the outcome of this. This is a full-scale assessment that's based on about something like 60-70 articles that look at this question, evidence that's there of what needs to get done and how is it working itself out. So for example, we were just talking about climate finance a little bit earlier. So this is the amount of money that the government has put into it. What are the elements of what needs to get done? So this is the how of and what needs to make it happen. So there's governance, there's finance, there's a question of building institutional capacity, then what are the policy instruments that make it work, fine. Then how do you deal with technology? How do you deal with, of course, questions of lifestyle and behavior change? So I've condensed lots of stuff, which is quite as it is quite dense into a set of slides. But what I'm saying is that these kind of frameworks are actually used and applied, and they work. Yeah. The question is, of course, is that cityscape, right? But eventually you've got to break it down to the ward, from the ward to the neighborhood, and it has to work for everybody in that process. And that's a hard business. So, we've spent the last 9 years trying to fix just one sector in one state of India, right? That's the water and sanitation sector. So my colleagues have worked to try and deal with water and sanitation they've impacted lots of people across 600 different places. But it takes that kind of effort and detail to make this happen. So the question, I guess, to come back to the pedagogical side is, how can somebody think about this kind of thing? How can somebody operationalize this kind of thing? Or what are the kinds of teams and institutions that have to think like this to be able to solve these problems? Because they are complex problems, they interact, fine? If you change your transportation system, it can do some good things for you, but it also has other consequences. So you've got to think of the systemic interactions, and of course how it can be done, who's going to do it, the political economy of making that happen, and the institutions and the incentives that actually transform markets and make other things work as far as that's concerned. So I thought I'd give you this example. There's lots of other stuff that I have. I won't bother you with it just now. There's really nice stuff that shows how this aggregates through India to the world, but I don't think we have time for that. But basically, you have to work with concrete processes and problems, bring together people from a whole range of different perspectives and institutional sort of capacities and and knowledges to try and solve these issues. Because at least as far as risk and climate is concerned, we're in a pretty bad shape. Yeah, we're in a pretty bad shape. And I can tell you that because I kind of co-led the report that was made famous by Greta Thunberg. You know about her? Yeah, the report that there was an incident that happened many years ago. I was in the General Assembly at that time where she glared at somebody. Right. And then she went to the US Congress and she said something which is, it rarely happens, where she said, look, listen to the scientists. And we were the guys who were the scientists. We wrote that report. In fact, my co-CLA was here with us yesterday, where we said, look, we can, this was in 2018, we can actually make the 1.5 guardrail in 2018. And today, what we're saying is that it's impossible because the carbon space has been taken. We will hit 1.5 potentially for the world before 2030 hits us. And what we're looking at just now is actually an exceedance of 2. And what people don't know is that the negotiations that many of us have been part about are not about 1.5. The Paris Agreement is about 2, about keeping below 2. Many of the small island states really push for 1.5, etc., etc. But the negotiations are happening at 3 degrees. That is what the negotiations are about. The negotiations that are happening in the COP, that's happening in Belém now, in another, 10 days' time, is about 3 degrees. Fine? And the trends are looking very nasty at the current point of time because we are now digging more coal, pumping more oil and more gas than we've ever done before. And it's very interesting because even the countries that are investing very, very significantly on decarbonizing and transforming their own country, reducing their emissions, increasing their resilience, if they have oil, gas and coal, are digging and pumping faster than they ever could. Why? That's one part of it, yes, of course. They're selling it to somebody who's buying it, but why are they doing this now? Because the prices are very high. So if you're like a country down under which is really trying to do really good stuff on the climate side, right? But you're selling your coal to all over Asia, you're doing that because if you don't do that, somebody else is going to sell it, and why shouldn't you get that money? Okay? So cities are where a lot of the action is. 75%, 70% of our emissions come from cities. Most of the action that will work are in cities. But cities don't have control over some of these processes which sit between national governments, the large energy companies, and the people who finance them, many of them who are within a few kilometers of where we're sitting. This is one of the 4 or 5 largest financial centers in the world that are funding this. And we've seen a big shift between 2018 and now. So if you look at post-COVID exploration for oil and gas, which had gone down dramatically, it's gone back again. Right? And there is one particular country which has basically said, as long as you allow us to export our stuff, it's fine. It doesn't matter what happens. It's not happening in any case, fine? So yeah, so cities can do a lot of stuff, but they're also constrained. And we need to understand the context in which they're working, and for that you need an exposure, an understanding, and an engagement with all kinds of people to be able to try and solve these problems. Because some of us are not going to be around when the stuff really hits the fan. It's going to go above 2 for sure, I can say. And in most cities, because the urban heat island is going to touch local temperature exceedances are going to be 6 degrees or more. So life is going to become really, really nasty, etc. And the real story is not the fact that it becomes warm. The real fact is it's going to rain, or there's going to be a lot more water, or much, much less water. The real story is not about temperature rise. It's about less or more water. Right? And finally, when there's less or more water, what happens? What collapses first?
Food.
Sorry?
Food.
Yes, food.
Yeah.
Exactly. The ecosystems collapse first. When I wrote the chapter with David that we talked about, 2014, basically we had done the scenario runs for 7 or 8 cities. London, New York, Dar es Salaam, Durban, Mumbai, etc. We actually ran it. In fact, we did the run here with Ken Livingstone was the mayor at that point of time. And we said, look, once you hit 1.7, 1.8 degrees, global, right? 1.8, that's a global change. Locally, the temperatures could be much higher. It doesn't matter where you are. You can have the Greenwich Barrier, you can have, New York has a wonderful supply system for its water, etc. It doesn't matter how rich the country is, how much technology you have. If the ecosystems start collapsing, it's a big challenge. Because the last 10,000 years, we've learned how to live and grow our food and get our water in a regime which is, I mean, it will be very difficult for us to come back. So we don't know as a society, as a culture, especially people in cities, of how to manage and grow stuff in an environment where the temperature is more than 2 degrees average. Apart from sea level rise, I'm not even talking about it. Yeah. That's a real story for London in some senses. First the flooding will come, and then the sea level rise. In fact, we were discussing this just yesterday, saying that we have to prepare for some of these larger cities. Cities came here for a very good reason. This is one of the biggest ports in the world. It is a tremendous economic center, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you think about this place 50 years from now, you might think of actually moving the national government to another location, because that barrier is not going to help you very much. Because the sea level rise is going to hit at least maybe 3 meters or more if it becomes even more significant. This is a tipping point. Most of the places where our cities are going to be, whether in Asia or Africa or even Europe, we have to plan for retreat. So think about somebody who's in the real estate market and saying, okay, how do I plan for retreat so that I can move my city in another direction? We have to think about different ways of thinking about that. So these are really, really concrete but very complex questions that we haven't even started engaging with. But you guys are going to have to do that. So you better get kitted up and go and do that. Sorry.
So I know, of course, Arama for 15 years, and you know why we haven't stopped talking for 15 years. So, and you also understand why we feel the urgency. When I started, I said we share the urgency, and this is very much an example of that. And we share that commitment to create a generation, a future generation of practitioners who can deal with it. Yeah. And so
you can't get depressed.
we have to find those islands of hope so that we can keep ourselves.
There are fantastic
motivated.
things happening in the world. It's just not all coming together.
Yeah.
And then you have some people who are going, they're going after Mars, they're going somewhere else. We have to ground ourselves and make this happen. It's not that difficult.
Okay, folks, the conversation continues. We don't stop, right? We keep going. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Arama, as always, for a stimulating and exciting presentation. Thanks, Neha, for coming. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Dialogues, because it's the one forum where you can talk to each other across courses very easily, and it's always a stimulating context. So do please tell your colleagues that it's a good space. Yeah? It's a good space also to ask any kind of question, as you can see. Yeah? So thank you so much, and see you soon.